In this lecture, we'll talk about the creation of an Anglo America in the United States, which is the modern day East Coast of the United States. Um, and we'll talk about how it becomes more anglicized over time. But essentially, you may have seen this before. These are like the three regions that were created by British America: New England, Middle Atlantic, and Southern. So it just goes by location. New England is the very tip of the northeastern part of the United States that includes Massachusetts, Connecticut, and East. Another very small, pretty small region, basically from Pennsylvania north through New York, and it did include New York too, were the Middle Atlantic. Now, go back and talk about the New England for just a minute. Those areas, it wasn't very conducive to have large farms. They had small family farms, but they mainly got involved in merchant type activities, shipbuilding, and things of that nature, which we'll talk about more when we talk about the origins of slavery. In the Middle Atlantic colonies, you did have larger farms. It was known as the breadbasket, and because rivers were very fertile, and so that region was able to produce quite a bit of farming. But in the southern colonies, that's where you see your largest farms. This is where, of course, plantations begin to form, where indentured servants, as we talked about last time, begin coming in. And so in those regions, you see like rice and tobacco and large, what's known as cash crops, begin to form in that area. Now, we talked about New England a little bit, and of course, the origin of New England were the Puritans, right? So the Puritans really begin to settle in 1629. Before that, there were Puritan separatists known as Pilgrims that formed, that of course formed Plymouth colony. But in that same region, in the Puritans, they leave England to escape religious persecution. And of course, what's the first thing they do when they get to the United States, or what would later be the United States? They begin to persecute people. And we saw that with Anne Hutchinson and Roger Williams. And then we also see that same type of restriction of freedoms and of that in probably one of the best known ways that rights were restricted during that time, and that was during the Salem witch trials. Now, I want to give you a little bit of context before I talk about this, and I also want to note that there's a video down below that goes into a little bit more detail about the Salem witch trials, and so I encourage you to watch that. Especially those of you that are interested in this. I also encourage you, should you ever make it out to Boston, or if you've been to that area, not too far from that is the town of Salem. And they have great historical preservation, museums, reenactments, and not exciting as in it was a terrible time in history, but exciting historically that they've got so much great stuff to look at and view there. But essentially, little context behind this. Witch trials and witchcraft and fear of witchcraft was all over the world. It was not just relegated to this town in Puritan Massachusetts, right? It was all over the world. And basically, they used witchcraft as an explanation to anything like medically odd that was happening to people, like for example, people that had epilepsy and had epileptic fits and seizures. They didn't know what happened, so they thought they were possessed by a demon. And so they used witchcraft as a reason that a lot of these things happened. So basically, it really starts off because a preacher's daughter and two daughters were having like fits, and they accused the black slave named Tituba of performing witchcraft. Whether or not that was, well, we would definitely think it was made up. But she becomes like the scapegoat for that. And it basically, and it becomes this massive deal in Salem. And in order for you not to be hanged for being a witch, you had to, number one, admit that you were a witch, and number two, blame somebody else. So you can already see where that's going, right? Of course, you're going to say, okay, I'm a witch and he did it. And so it just becomes this massive thing where a lot of people begin to accuse each other. By the end of it, 150 people were accused, 19 people were hanged, 14 of them women. One guy was actually pressed to death. Literal his bones were crushed. And that's how he died, because he wouldn't admit he was a witch. And so today we look at that as like a witch hunt, right? That's where the modern terminology comes from. Okay, so beyond that, there were other developments in the colonies during colonial times. And one of the biggest things was the fact that the British Empire begins to see the colonies in Americas as potentially very economically to persevere and to try to get more settlers out there to grow economically. And so they did encourage people from England to settle, but they began to realize that they need to attract settlers from other parts of Europe. And so they start to make it very enticing. At that time, Great Britain actually had many more freedoms than most places, not really for many more groups other than white men, but they definitely had more than other European countries at that time. And so to have British citizenship was a positive thing. Plus, economically, you could really grow. And it was a place where you could grow. So it attracts settlers. You could get citizenship after 7 years. Most of the people that settle in the frontier area. And what I mean by that is not like the West, like we think of the West today. It's the western part of the 13 colonies. So the western part of Pennsylvania, the western part of Virginia. That area was Indian territory. There were Native Americans that were there, and so it was quite dangerous for settlers to go out there. But it could be quite lucrative for them if they could survive that. Yeah, that's one thing that they did to try to attract more people. Another thing that some of the colonies did was what William Penn did in Pennsylvania. And Pennsylvania was the largest, or at that time, largest of the middle colonies. And it becomes like a beacon of religious tolerance. They accepted anybody's religion. They would be really tolerated in that area. It attracted all different types of economic diversity there. And so economic and ethnic diversity, all of those different types of diversity into it. And they become like the place where really toleration begins in the Americas quite a bit. It actually becomes the first state later on to outlaw slavery completely. But one thing that they did that was quite progressive for that time period was their policy on Native American and Native American land. If people were settling and they would give them the land cheaply, and they were settling on an area that was Native American land, they had to show William Penn that they had permission. They either paid or made some sort of a deal with Native Americans to get that land. Did they lie about it? Did they make it up? I'm 100% sure that there's cases that included that. But the fact that there was even that policy in the books and that type of tolerance for Native Americans was progressive for that time. Okay. All right. So speaking about Native Americans were essentially just pushed off the land. So Native Americans were pushed further and further west, and some of them become so decimated that their entire nation goes away and they form other nations. An example of that was the Catawba in South Carolina. They do start to become more accustomed to living near white people, relying on them for tools and clothing and things of that nature. But they don't go away, and they fight for the land that they were that belonged to them. They felt that was an encroachment on their land. And so there is quite a bit of skirmishes with people on the frontier. Now, regarding Native Americans and comparing it to like Spanish America, for example, very focused on conversion of Native Americans. And I'll bet it was a very cruel way. They at least tried to convert the Native Americans. The British had absolutely no desire to tolerate or convert or do anything with the Native Americans other than get them off the land. So this was an important aspect and difference between them. There were some small examples of caveats to that, like the praying town that existed in the New England area. They did have small towns in which they did that, but essentially the Native Americans are really just pushed off the land. There was one instance in which one Native American group and one Native American leader fought back, and his name was Metacom, or better known as King Philip. And he actually fought people in New England for nearly a year. And he basically got a lot of the different Native American nations to try to oust out the British. And it was because of an accusation and a hanging of two of his people without consulting with King Philip at all, or Metacom. And it essentially ended not in Metacom's favor. He was killed. He was hanged and beheaded, and his head, along with several other of his leaders, were put on stakes along a road as an example. This was a very common British tactic. They did this in Great Britain as well. Now, some of the Native Americans were sold off to slavery. Some were able to escape to Canada, but most of their fate was not good. And there is a video, by the way, about King Philip and Metacom down below as well. We also see the creation of social classes that begin. The elite, top percent, very few of them, a large middle class, and unfortunately, too, a large group of poverty too. But poverty included people that didn't own land and slaves. And we will talk about the origin of slavery in the British colonies in our next lesson. The last thing I want to talk about is the status of women in the colonies. Now, I will start with this. Women in the colonies during this time actually had quite a bit of autonomy. So, this is before 1700s-ish. So when women originally came here, there weren't that many laws, like British laws, that had leaked over to the colonies. Women were able to own land, especially if their husbands died, so they didn't remarry because they would lose that claim to land if they did that. But women enjoyed quite a bit of autonomy. Then as the colonies grew, the British laws crept into the colonies and women lost more and more autonomy. And so pretty soon, primogeniture laws, which were a big part of the British Empire, which said that the land would go to the eldest son and women would have to rely on relatives that would care for them for the rest of their lives, that integrated into the colonies. And also women weren't allowed to really be anywhere beyond the home, beyond that sphere. It's going to change somewhat during the Revolution, and we'll talk about that, but only for a short time until the 1800s when they're relegated to home again. Okay, so I'm going to try to stop there so we keep it within 12 minutes, but I hope that you enjoyed that lesson.